It is well known that learning a new language requires 4 different skills: listening, reading, writing, and speaking. Today, we are going to focus just on one: listening.
Chapter 1: Listening in the World and in Language Learning. Why and how? We listen primarily because there are things we need to know. We learn to listen and we listen to learn. Unlike animals, humans have another reason to listen. Sounds can stimulate the imagination and enrich our lives. The primary purposes of human listening are information gathering and pleasure. There are other reasons such as empathy, assessment, and criticism.
Why listening is difficult? The difficulties can be grouped into 4 general categories: characteristics of the message, the delivery, the listener, and the environment. First of all, the message, which has to do with unknown words, complex grammatical structures, and familiarity on the topic. The delivery. In this factor, we can recognize 2 different kinds of listening: reciprocal and non-reciprocal. For reciprocal listening, we have interaction between the speaker. For this, listeners can ask for clarification or to slow down. However, in non-reciprocal listening, the listener does not have opportunity to contribute to a dialogue. For this, it is considered as more difficult than reciprocal listening. Other characteristics of the delivery can include accent. The listener. Some temporary characteristics that could affect the listener might include anxiety, tiredness, or boredom. However, there are other aspects that vary the way in which listeners perceive listening, such as age and personal interests. For this, it is important to consider different teaching and listening strategies in order to make learners feel comfortable with this skill. And finally, environment. These may include the temperature of the room, background noise, or defective equipment, which affects the clarity of a recording.
While examining the difficulties, researchers have tended to use 2 models to describe the listening process. There are the top-down model and the bottom-up model. Let's review the latter. The bottom-up model emphasizes the decoding of the smallest units, phonemes and syllables, to lead us towards meaning. Whereas the top-down model emphasizes the use of the background knowledge to predict the content, is based at least in part on the listener. Additionally, when we use both processes simultaneously when we listen, it is known as the interactive model. Why students should listen to English? There are several reasons why. Let's see. Access to the world, pressure, travel, tourism, work purposes, and academic requirements. The place of listening in language teaching. David Noonan describes listening as the Cinderella skill overshadowed by its big sister, speaking. Listening is probably the key initial skill. After all, we cannot talk without listening first.
Communicative language teaching, CLT. It emphasizes the use of English for real communication rather than demonstration of target grammar and vocabulary. Using information, gap activities, role plays, games, and discussion of real issues, CLT seeks to engage the student on a personal level through meaningful interaction and personalization. Hearing English in context. Language use occurs in authentic contexts which involve human relationships and fixed situations that may require certain language in order to proceed smoothly. For this, listening reinforces the importance of context. One thing that listening can do is to provide a model or an ideal for students to aspire to, copy, or learn from. If our students hear highly proficient speakers, other abilities such as speaking will improve too. Lastly, it must be said that one of the teacher's role is to prepare students to succeed in any given listening task, thereby building their confidence.
Now let's take a look to chapter number 2, listening tests and listening strategies. First of all, what makes a good listening test? Certain aspects such as reliability, relevance of the information, new information, and appropriateness are factors that influence how good a text can be. However, these aspects can be divided into two important fields: content and delivery. Now let's take a look to the first aspect, content. This is composed by different factors. For example, interest factor, which means that you need to approach a personal stake on your students. The second one, the entertainment factor, because who wants to get bored while listening? Then, density, which means that even though you are an advanced user of the language, if the listening is composed or full of a lot of information, you can get overwhelmed. And finally, language level, which means that the listening should be appropriate for the language level of your students. Now, delivery. Delivery deals with length, quality of the recordings, accent, speech, and number of speakers.
Authentic versus pedagogic. One way to define authenticity might be to say that if the text exists for a communicative purpose other than teaching language, then it is authentic. However, there is a certain criticism in texts like dialogues. It is said that it represents nothing like the mass of real communication in real situations, since there is always the same speed and interruptions do not take place. Although there is an abundance of authentic material on the internet, most of it doesn't come in a pedagogical framework. Preview questions, comprehension questions, discussion points, etc. This means that the teacher may need to spend a considerable amount of time preparing authentic materials for classroom use. As we can see in this chart, there are certain differences between authentic and scripted methodology.
Oh, hey again! Now let's review some of the good strategies good listeners use. But what are strategies? Strategies consist of the conscious delivery behaviors which enhance the learning process and allows the learner to use information more effectively. Okay, so good listeners use different strategies. Let's take a look. Cognitive strategies, metacognitive, and socio-affective. Cognitive strategies deal with the immediate task. For example, you can look for information before having a listening activity, probably in your L1. Metacognitive, it deals with the learning in general, and it has long-term benefits. And finally, socio-affective strategies deal with the learner's interaction with other speakers and also with the attitude of the learner regarding the language process.
Finally, these are some strategies to apply in our listening lessons. The first one, be ready and have a plan to achieve a given task. The second one, use word knowledge to predict what will be said. Listen for keywords for topic identification. Check with other listeners. And finally, ask for clarification. Welcome to Chapter 3. The characteristics of effective listening. First of all, let us consider the mythical creature called a good listener. But what does it mean to be a good listener? Very few people would listen if they didn't know it was their turn, but in face-to-face conversation, they may do some of the following. Use attentive body language, look the speaker in the eye, use expressions such as, I see, yes, etc. to show they are paying attention. Ask questions such as what, where, how, if they don't understand something. Try to predict what the speaker is going to say next, and finally, know the meaning of silence. But what about good listeners in L2? One thing we need to remember is that language students, like the rest of us, are really good listeners all the same time. Some of them may be good when listening to a football commentary in a foreign language, but poor when the teacher plays a recording of John and Mary discussing the weather. Why? Because motivation plays a vital role, so the topic and its relevance to the listeners are crucial. So, what else might make good L2 listeners good? Good listeners tend to think ahead and predict the meaning of the whole text. They are engaged and see themselves as participants in an interaction rather than passive receptacles of messages. They also have the ability to focus on valuable information while ignoring everything else that they hear. Good listeners persevere, realizing that hypotheses they make can be checked later. Good listeners also became aware of irony and other tones of voice. Overall, good listeners are strategic, they are organized, and they have a plan to achieve the task. Of course, all the listeners suffer moments of confusion while listening, but rather than switching off and saying, "I don't understand," good listeners tend to say, "I didn't understand, but I'll try to get it."
Now let's analyze different sources of listening. The first one is teacher talk. Students may not even be aware that they are practicing the skill, but listening to the teacher is the most frequent and valuable form of input during lessons. The first aspect we need to analyze about teacher talk is planned input. In this one, teachers prepare an activity for the students in which they have to listen carefully to every single word in order to follow certain instructions. Another very important aspect is semi-planned input. It refers to a pedagogical sequence prepared but not scripted by the teacher. For example, when you provide some pictures, you know that they are going to talk about the pictures, but you don't know the exact words students are going to use. Finally, spontaneous input. This includes encouraging students with words. Quality teacher talk. Let's analyze some of the qualities of this kind of talk. First, get the volume and the speed right. Prepare the students adequately. Watch your vocabulary. Provide visual support. Cut the colloquialism. Be aware of formality. Make it interactive. Pause and paraphrase, and move in linear sequences.
Student talk. Just as there is planned, semi-planned, and spontaneous talk from the teacher, there should be the same from the students. And there are any number of things that students can speak about in groups that will develop their listening as well as their speaking skills. Some of them are jigsaw task with an information gap, in which text or pictures must be organized and described. Reporting back. For this, students have to report back on what was said. And finally, making a presentation.
Another way of giving students access to a live, authentic, real-time conversation is to invite a proficient or native speaker of English into the class. This is called guest speaker. This has many potential advantages. Firstly, a new face and voice are always stimulating in a regular class. Another benefit is that the language is semi-planned or unplanned, but the speakers have a sense of an audience and may find themselves paraphrasing and recapping. One way of planning a lesson with a guest speaker involves a number of stages, some of which are optional. Listening to a guest speaker, an approach. In this chart, you may find the way to introduce the guest and to use this useful approach in your listening class.
Other useful materials to integrate in our listening lessons are textbook recordings, which lead to variety with content like stories, jokes, songs, and situational dialogues. Besides, it provides discussion points at the end, and all of this saves the teacher a lot of work.
Besides, these textbooks reinforce grammar or vocabulary that has been recently studied, since most of them have the transcripts of the recordings in the back of the book. Different tools are television, video, and DVD, whose material is frequently authentic, with real-world information, and that it provides the visual aspect, being able to see the speakers and their context, and body language is a huge advantage to listeners. Songs, which can be enjoyable, memorable, and stimulating for the students, since they choose the content. Songs can also help students focus on pronunciation and predict vocabulary with the use of rhyme. And finally, Internet, in which learners can look for language learning websites with repeatable activities, which means that students can work at their own pace.
Chapter 4. Pre-listening skills and activities. Pre-listening. These stages help our students to prepare for what they are going to hear. It gives them a greater chance of success in any given task. Pre-listening involves two stages: activating schemata and setting up reasons to listen. Activating schemata. This tunes students into the topic and helps them to develop their expectations of the input. 6 practical ways to activate a student's schemata are: brainstorming, visuals, realia, texts, words, situations, opinions, ideas, and facts. Establishing reasons for listening. After activating a schemata, it is necessary to give students the purpose for listening. Few general principles such as make the purpose realistic, make the goal achievable, and get the students involved.
Welcome to Chapter 5, While Listening Skills and Activities. Let's start with a very interesting question. Why it is a good idea to use while listening activities? Well, students must in some way use the information they hear. Content should demand a response, and students would think and react. Activities contribute to or help shape this response. Now, in this part, we can identify 2 types of responses. The first one, response involving production. For this, we have activities such as note-taking, writing answers, and complete charts. However, this demands developing other skills than just listening. On the other hand, we have responses involving recognition. Some activities for these are multiple choice, true-false questions, take words or phrases that students hear, and matching and choosing pictures. In this part, students would have less to do and, as a consequence, would be much more focused and concentrated. Now, let's identify 3 types of listening. The first one, listening for gist. For example, when students listen to an audio for the first time and they just focus on the main idea. Now, listening for detail. In this part, students would have listened the second time or the third time an audio, and then they will focus on specific info. And finally, selective listening. In this, students would extract information, ignore most of what they heard, and focus on what is relevant. Now, let's take a look to some activities for selective listening. Some of them are bingo, times, dates, and numbers, spot the difference, and story told twice. Now, let's see some other activities. Inferring. In this, students make deductions by going beyond of stated, and some very useful activities are pause the audio and predict, and not her, not him. Another useful activity is note-taking. This promotes attention in students and picks out important points in a talk. Some interesting activities are guided note-taking, phone messages, hidden picture, and chart summary. Now, dictation. Although most people would say that this is not communicative and may be associated with grammar and translation, the real thing is that there are very good reasons for using it. For example, students are active before, during, and after the dictation. Also, this is multi-skilled activity since it involves listening, speaking, writing, and reading. And finally, this is a very flexible activity. Now, some activities for dictation which will demand interaction and student decision making are Dictogloss, picture dictation, full stack dictation, running dictation, running translation dictation, and transcribe. And finally, listen and do. This is a variation of TPR since students will respond orally. This is very useful for young learners. Let's take a look to some activities. Simon says, last one is out, stand up if, blind man's bluff, grab the word and just do it.
Chapter 6. Pause listening. This is the stage that happens right after the while listening stage. This stage involves class check answers, discusses difficulties such as unknown vocabulary, respond to the content of the passage, and it discusses useful language and particular grammatical structures.
As we could see, the pause listening is the step in which students can reflect on their listening experience. So now, let's take a look to some useful activities for pause listening. First of all, reflecting. In this activity, teachers can check answers and give a diagnostic in order to achieve long-term goals. Second one, checking and summarizing. It focuses on what students understood rather than their weaknesses. Students do something with the info and they remember details. Discussion. In this part, own ideas are reflected. And problem solving is a very good activity too. Reconstructing the listening text. In this part, students can do activities such as gap fill, reordering, or storyboard. Students have to deal with many aspects of language, such as grammar, vocabulary, and discourse features of spoken English.
Hey, welcome to Chapter 7. This chapter is called Preparation and Planning. For this chapter, we are going to discuss several topics. The first one is features as planners. So we have two different types, short-term and long-term. Let's discuss now the short-term planning, okay? Okay, so the short-term teacher's role. These deal with aspects such as individual lessons and keeping in mind learning goals. For example, we as teachers need to know that when we plan lessons, we expect our students to learn what we want them to learn. However, this is not the reality. They sometimes learn what we plan, but sometimes they learn another things. So, professional teachers, we need to keep this in mind. Professional teachers always keep in mind specific goals for the students. To do this, in listening, we need to focus on three different aspects. For example, how many times do the students listen to the audio? And how many times do I have to pause the audio for them to be focused on specific items? And when or how to explain and interact with the students and the audio we are playing. This is very important for the short-term teacher's role.
Now, for the long-term part, it is important for teachers to take into account different aspects, such as what information would be useful for our students listening. Now, it is important for teachers to keep in mind that the kind of information must not be transferable from detail 1. In this case, it is important to avoid cases like intonation or cultural aspects. On the other hand, it is also important to mention that not everything is related to listening, but to the English part itself. But this might be linked to pronunciation.
Now, as part of Chapter 7, let's analyze the role of listening in the syllabus. So, a good listening in the syllabus will have a complete character of planned, unplanned, and spontaneous speech, dialogues, monologues, and different sorts of things. Apart from this, the materials, the needs, and the focus of the institution is very important in the syllabus of listening and the inclusion of this important skill during the learning process of a language.
Now, let's go with choosing and adapting materials. This is a very important part because it leads teachers to modify or change certain aspects in textbooks. We are going to just be focused on textbooks. So, these are some options to do in our lessons. So, for example, make the sequence easier, more challenging, extended, or shorter. On the other hand, we have other possibilities, such as reorder the sequence of the textbook or change the focus of the sequence. For example, if the textbook is focused on grammar, we can change that focus and just do it with vocabulary. Now, let's go with authentic materials. In this part, we are going to give you very useful tips for materials for listening classes. So, how to find them? Of course, in the net, ELT listening downloads. Very useful tips. Look for the first pages on Google. Then, continue visiting those trusted web pages. Now, how to exploit a recording? Well, if it's a radio or a recording, we can use these materials very, very often. Now, we can use a WH chart, which questions such as what, when, who, etc. And if it's a TV or a video material, we can do some activities such as vision on or sound off, or vice versa, sound on and vision off. Now, we can do something different, watch and describe, or finally, complete the story.
We need to know how to create our own authentic materials that sometimes we don't find the specific audio recorded about certain topics, so we need to make it ourselves, okay? So we can count on no media, which means that we can bring a special guest, recording before and during the lesson so the students be aware of what they're talking. And it's important to know that storing the materials physically and electronically is very important for the process. Now, in how to plan students' creative materials, we can ask them to record or make a video about a mishap, an anecdote, and it's very useful.
Chapter 8: Integrated Listening. As we have seen in previous chapters, the four skills, reading, writing, speaking, and listening, rarely take place in isolation. The majority of EFL and ESL lessons combine the four skills plus grammar, vocabulary, and pronunciation. In fact, it has been proved that the teaching of English is more effective when integrated with other skills. Having said this, let's take a look to the difference between the listening lesson and listening in the lesson. The listening lesson aims to improve the students' listening only. It incorporates strategies to examine those problematical areas where listening is difficult. However, listening in the lesson entails using a recording or listening to a teacher or other speakers to elaborate on a given topic, given a context for grammar or vocabulary.
Even non-listening lessons will benefit our students' listening. Learning new grammar and vocabulary improves listening because it allows the students to broaden the range of input that is comprehensible to them. Improved reading also benefits listeners as the inner voice pronounces the words and the students develop their vocabulary and awareness of discourse patterns. Of all the skills that complement listening, pronunciation has arguably the closest link. Every focus on every aspect of pronunciation is also focused on listening. In addition to these points, rhythm and the way sounds change in connected speech, intonation is also a listening issue. It affects the meaning of an utterance. For example, intonation alerts us to the mood or attitude of the speaker and also tell us via the falling pitch when the speaker has finished.